The kettle was already whistling when I walked in and heard my daughter-in-law say, "We'll just say she's slipping." Still, I didn't interrupt, just turned the flame down low and watched the steam coil like a secret. As her voice carried, the hiss softened but never vanished, like truth refusing to be buried. While she laughed into the phone, I traced the lip of my mug, its heat anchoring my restraint. The same steam that once meant comfort now reminded me how easy warmth is to fake. That's when I decided they'd taste silence the way I serve it, boiled down, slow, and final. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The house was quiet enough to hear the rain tapping on the kitchen skylight. A low, steady sound, like fingers drumming against a secret. Irene stood just outside the archway, her slippers silent on the hardwood, her breath slow and measured. Inside, Brianna leaned against the counter, phone pressed between her shoulder and cheek, voice dipped in false sympathy. "She's forgetting things again. It's sad, Ethan. We'll have to step in before something happens." Ethan's muffled reply floated through the phone speaker. "Yeah, maybe it's time." Brianna sighed dramatically, flipping through the mail as though grief could be sorted by envelopes. "It's just little things, you know? Bills misplaced, names slipping. The other day she couldn't remember where the coffee filters were." She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that invited agreement. Irene didn't move. She watched the back of Brianna's head, the slow tilt as she performed her lie, and something inside her, something precise, patient, and long underestimated, clicked into focus. From the corner of her eye, she caught movement. Nora was on the stairs, halfway down, frozen mid-step. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the air thickened. The teenager didn't speak, just watched, her face pale, jaw tight. She understood more than anyone ever gave her credit for. Brianna kept talking. "She'll resist, of course. She always does, but it's for her own good." She chuckled again, softer this time. "Besides, once the paperwork's in motion, it'll be easier for everyone." Easier for everyone. Irene's fingers curled against her palm, not in anger, but in calculation. She'd spent decades solving problems no one else could. Equations that filled boards. Proofs that demanded silence and time. People often mistook silence for weakness. They never learned that silence was simply the sound of thinking. She turned and walked up the stairs. Each creak sounded deliberate, unhurried. In her bedroom, the curtains glowed faintly with the reflection of gray daylight. She crossed to the closet, opened it, and pulled out the old cedar box that had belonged to her late husband. Inside, beneath tax records and photographs, sat a small brass key. The filing cabinet in her study opened with a quiet, metallic sigh. The smell of paper and dust filled the room. Order, control, memory cataloged. Her hand didn't tremble as she flipped through labeled folders. Mortgage, insurance, medical, and finally, POA, updated 2019. The folder was thick, its weight familiar, almost comforting. She set it on the desk beside the small green banker's lamp. The rain outside had strengthened into a steady sheet against the window, blurring the world into shades of gray. Downstairs, she could still hear Brianna's voice. "She needs guidance, Ethan. She can't manage all this alone." Irene opened the folder. Each page was crisp, notarized, and exact. Her own signature stared back at her beside Patricia Kim's letterhead. Legal language, clear, airtight. And there, in black ink, the name that mattered. Nora Clark, successor agent and attorney in fact. She smiled faintly, a small upturn that never reached her eyes. People assumed decline meant helplessness. They didn't realize how quietly a prepared mind could move. She heard Nora's soft footsteps behind her. The girl lingered in the doorway, hesitant. "Grandma." Irene turned slightly. You heard her? Nora nodded. She's lying. I know. What are you gonna do? Irene closed the folder gently, as though tucking in a sleeping secret. What I've always done, sweetheart. Show my work. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The 73-year-old woman who refused to be erased, and the 17-year-old who was learning what power looked like when it was quiet. Then Irene reached for the lamp switch. Go back downstairs. Don't let her see that you heard. Nora hesitated, then nodded and disappeared down the hall. The room dimmed to a soft green glow. Irene rested her hand on the folder's cover, tracing the embossed label with her fingertip. The paper smelled faintly of ink and permanence. From downstairs, Brianna's laughter floated up again, sharp and confident. Irene's smile deepened, almost tender. She whispered to herself, "Let her think she's winning." Thunder rolled low across the sky. Irene slid the folder into her leather satchel and snapped the buckle shut. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering the roof like applause. And as she stepped toward the door, the house felt different. No longer small or quiet, but alive with purpose. The next afternoon smelled of lemon polish and wet coats. The Clarks' dining room gleamed. Table set for 6. Crystal glasses lined like a promise. Brianna had invited a few close friends over, she'd said, to lift everyone's spirits. Irene knew better. Brianna's spirits didn't lift. They staged performances. Laughter drifted from the doorway as guests arrived. 2 neighbors from down the block and a church acquaintance Irene barely remembered. Brianna moved like a hostess from a lifestyle magazine, crisp blouse, bright smile. Ethan stood nearby, smiling when prompted, nodding as if approval were currency he couldn't afford to spend. "Mom," Brianna called sweetly from the kitchen. "Could you grab the dinner plates?" Irene rose from her seat, smoothing her cardigan. The kitchen cabinets gleamed under the recessed lights, every handle identical, deliberately confusing to someone who didn't live there. Brianna followed, lowering her voice to a syrupy murmur. "The plates are in the cabinet over the sink, remember?" The words slid into the air with practiced pity. Irene paused, her hand resting on the counter. She looked straight at Brianna, calm as a professor caught mid-lecture. "I taught calculus for 31 years, she said evenly. "I can find a cabinet." For a beat, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Brianna laughed, a brittle little sound meant to cover embarrassment. "Of course you can. I just didn't want you to strain yourself." "I appreciate your concern." Irene opened the correct cabinet and lifted the stack of plates. Steady hands, perfect precision. When they returned to the dining room, conversation buzzed again, light but loaded. Brianna launched into another round of anecdotes about how forgetful we all get with age, her tone playful, eyes flicking toward Irene after each sentence. Irene sat quietly, watching the scene unfold. Guests nodded politely, the way people do when they don't want to get involved. One neighbor even said, "Oh, my mother's the same way. Can't remember her own phone number." Brianna smiled, victorious. Nora, sitting at the far end of the table, slid her phone onto her lap. The faint vibration of a new message pulsed against Irene's handbag a moment later. "Nora, they're planning something. I'll help." Irene glanced down, her expression unchanged. She reached for her water glass and took a slow sip before typing one word back under the tablecloth. "Irene. Good." Then she added another. "Irene. I already started." Dinner dragged on, filled with small talk and hidden barbs. Brianna's voice carried a practiced lightness, her compliments edged like blades. Ethan stared into his plate. Nora's eyes flicked between them, a silent sentinel. When dessert was cleared, Irene excused herself. Upstairs, in the quiet of her study, The hum of conversation softened to an indistinct murmur below. She pulled the blue folder from her satchel and opened it again, checking each signature, each notarized seal. Everything was exactly where it should be. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the window glass. Gray hair neat, posture still strong. The rain had started again, tapping gently against the panes, as if reminding her of the clockwork rhythm she'd always trusted. Observe, calculate, act. She reached for the small notebook she kept in the desk drawer. Inside were dates, names, and neatly written notes, observations of every concern Brianna had voiced in the past 2 months. The frequency, the audience, even the phrasing. Evidence, if she ever needed it. Downstairs, laughter erupted again. Brianna's tone carried through the floorboards. "We're just worried about her making mistakes. She gets confused sometimes. Doesn't she, Ethan?" A pause, then Ethan's hesitant voice. "Maybe a little." Irene smiled faintly, almost pitying him. Weakness could be forgiven, malice could not. She flipped to a blank page and wrote, "Tomorrow, call Patricia Kim. Elder Law. Schedule appointment." The pen left a crisp trail of ink. Her handwriting was firm, deliberate. She tore out the page, folded it once, and slipped it into the front pocket of her purse. When she descended the stairs again, Brianna was collecting cups. "Mom, did you get lost up there?" she asked with mock cheer. Irene tilted her head, serene. "Just finding what I needed." Brianna smiled tightly. "Everything all right?" "Perfect," Irene said, and she meant it. Later that night, when the guests had gone and the dishwasher hummed in the dark, Irene sat at her desk once more. Her calendar lay open beside the lamp, the glow painting her hands in soft gold. She dialed Patricia Kim's office number, left a crisp, composed message. "Patricia, it's Irene Clark. I believe it's time we reviewed my power documents. Call me tomorrow morning." She hung up, folded her hands, and looked out into the storm. The morning after the dinner, Spokane was washed clean by rain. The sky hung low and gray, and mist rose from the sidewalks like breath. Irene drove downtown slowly, both hands steady on the steering wheel, windshield wipers whispering their rhythmic sweep. The blue folder rested on the passenger seat, belted in, like a passenger who mattered more than anyone she'd ever driven. Downtown Spokane was all muted color and reflected puddles. She parked in front of a brick building trimmed in dark green metal. The brass plate by the door read, "Patricia Kim, Attorney at Law, Estate and Elder Affairs." Inside, the office smelled of polished wood and coffee beans. A wall clock ticked with patient precision. Irene signed her name at the reception desk, and the young assistant smiled politely before disappearing down a hallway lined with framed degrees and newspaper clippings. Moments later, Patricia appeared, a compact woman in her 60s with silver hair cut into a neat bob and reading glasses perched halfway down her nose. Her voice carried the calm of someone who never raised it unless a judge was listening. "Irene Clark," she said, offering her hand. "It's good to see you again. You don't call unless something requires precision." "Then you already know why I'm here." Patricia smiled faintly. "Let's go to my office." The room was lined with books. Real books, not digital replicas. Law, psychology, ethics, even poetry. The blinds were half closed against the gray daylight, giving the space the hush of a confessional. Patricia gestured for Irene to sit, then poured coffee into heavy ceramic cups. "You mentioned power documents," Patricia began. Irene unbuckled her bag and slid the blue folder across the desk. The click of the latch sounded final, deliberate. "They're circling," she said simply. "My daughter-in-law has been whispering. She's clever enough to sound compassionate." Patricia opened the folder and began reviewing the pages with the eyes of someone who could smell deceit through ink. Her pen tapped lightly against her chin. "You're 2 steps ahead already," she said after a moment. "This is airtight." "Good," Irene replied. "Because they think I'm not." Patricia looked up. There was no pity in her face, only respect. "You've named Nora as your agent. That stops everything they're planning. Legally, no one can override your decisions while you're competent, and you are." Irene's gaze didn't waver. "Then it's time to use it." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "Tell me what's happened so far." Irene described it carefully. No embellishment, no emotion wasted. The phone call, the dinner, the deliberate forgetfulness Brianna tried to script. Patricia listened, jotting notes in perfect shorthand, her expression unreadable but increasingly cold. When Irene finished, Patricia closed her notebook. "We'll make this official. I'll draft a formal notice revoking any assumption of default guardianship. It will go to both Ethan and Brianna. I'll copy their family attorney as well." She turned to her computer, fingers moving with surgical precision. The sound of typing filled the room, controlled, rhythmic, decisive. Irene sipped her coffee and let herself exhale for the first time that day. Patricia paused, reading over the document. "This letter will remind them that under state law, no guardianship, conservatorship, or medical authority can be pursued without due evaluation and consent. You are explicitly competent and have a legally recognized agent, Nora Clark. It cuts off any back-channel manipulation before it starts." Irene's mouth twitched into something between a smile and a strategy. "That should unsettle her." "Good," Patricia said. "Unsettled people make mistakes." Outside, a delivery truck rolled by, its tires splashing water against the curb. The noise faded, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescent light. Patricia printed 2 copies of the letter, slid one across the desk. "Read this carefully." Irene took her time. Every word was clean, unambiguous, protective. She signed with a steady hand. Patricia gathered the pages into a sealed envelope, pressed her thumb to the flap. "I'll have certified copies mailed today. If they call you, or show up unannounced, say nothing. Refer them to me." "I can do that." Patricia gave her a long, assessing look. "You always could?" For a moment, the 2 women sat in silence, the kind that comes from shared understanding between people who've seen power abused and reclaimed. When Irene finally stood, she adjusted her scarf and picked up the folder. "I'll be at home," she said, waiting for them to realize what just slipped out of their hands. Patricia nodded once. "And if they push harder?" Irene turned at the doorway, her eyes sharper than the gray light spilling in. "Then they'll find out what happens when you try to corner someone who still knows how to do the math." She stepped into the hall. The echo of her shoes on tile followed her all the way to the elevator. By Tuesday morning, the rain had turned from steady to spiteful. The sky hung low and pewter-colored, clouds pressing down like a secret refusing to stay buried. Irene sat at her kitchen table with a cup of black coffee cooling beside the envelope Patricia had handed her the day before. The envelope was thick, sealed in official weight, stamped in red with certified mail. Patricia had already printed 2 copies for mailing, but this was the original, the one Irene would sign in her own home, at her own table. Her pen hovered above the line, her name already printed in neat, precise letters, Irene M. Clark. She took a slow breath, steadying the tremor that wasn't fear, but focus. Then, with deliberate grace, she signed. The sound of the pen scratching against paper felt like something ancient and irrevocable, an act of ownership reclaimed. From the hallway, Nora's voice called softly, "Grandma, Patricia just emailed me. There's something for me to pick up." Irene smiled, still looking at her signature. "That'll be your packet," she said. "It means what's theirs no longer is." Nora stepped closer, holding her phone. She said, I'm your successor agent. What does that mean, exactly? Irene folded the letter, slipped it into its envelope, and looked up with the kind of calm that only comes from having already won. It means, darling, that if anyone ever tries to make decisions for me, you're the one who decides whether they even get to ask. Nora's eyebrows lifted slightly. So, Brianna can't. She can't do anything. Irene interrupted, her tone measured, final. Not legally, not financially, not ever again. A small smile crept across Nora's face, the kind of expression that mirrored Irene's own quiet precision. I'll make sure Patricia gets your signed copy. Good. And take an umbrella. It's a day made for keeping things dry and proper. When Nora left, Irene rose and walked to the window. Outside, the maple tree in the yard was shedding its last few yellow leaves, each one twisting as it fell. Graceful. Inevitable. By afternoon, Patricia texted, "Delivered. Certified copies mailed. Clock starts now." That simple message settled something deep in Irene's chest. She moved through the house with a sense of final order, resetting drawers, updating passwords, rewriting the alarm code. When she reached the panel by the door, she hesitated only a moment before erasing the old 4 digits, 1982, her son's birth year. She replaced it with 2019, the year she had last updated her power of attorney, the year she had decided quietly to stop being sentimental. By evening, the house glowed warm against the gloom. Nora returned with the confirmation packet, a neat white envelope with her name printed across the top in bold, Nora Clark, authorized agent. She placed it gently on the counter. Feels important? It is, Irene said. Keep it somewhere you won't forget, and don't tell them it arrived. Nora nodded. Should I open it? Not yet. You'll know when. The doorbell rang then. 3 short chimes. Impatient. Brianna stepped in without waiting for an answer, the scent of her perfume cutting through the smell of dinner. You changed the alarm code, she said, crossing her arms. I couldn't get in earlier. I did, Irene replied evenly, turning back to the pot of soup simmering on the stove. Brianna forced a brittle laugh. Well, I hope you didn't forget how to turn it off again. You know how these systems can confuse people. Irene stirred once, then looked up, her eyes level and unflinching. No, she said softly. But I've remembered who pays the electric. For the first time, Brianna didn't have a rehearsed response. The silence that followed was taut, humming, electric in its own way. Ethan appeared behind her, rain dripping from his coat, eyes darting between them. Everything okay? Perfect, Irene said. Your mail came today, by the way. Brianna frowned. Mail? Yes, Irene replied, wiping her hands on a towel. From my attorney. Certified. Brianna blinked, confusion flickering just long enough for Irene to savor it. Nora's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. Patricia's text flashed across the screen. Both notices signed for. Time stamped at 4:17 p.m. Irene caught Nora's eye and gave the smallest nod. The rain began again, sudden and hard, tapping against the windows like a verdict being written. Brianna shifted uneasily, sensing something had tilted but unable to see how far. Well, she said too brightly, I'll let you get back to whatever you were doing. Irene smiled thinly. Yes, you should. She waited until the door clicked shut behind them, then walked to the counter, opened Nora's confirmation packet, and slipped the signed letter inside. For safekeeping, she said quietly. The rain had stopped by Thursday morning, leaving the streets slick and silver. Clouds hung low over downtown Spokane as Irene and Nora stepped out of the car, their umbrellas closed but ready, just in case. The sign above the brick building gleamed faintly in the weak light. Riverway Credit Union. Inside, the air smelled faintly of toner and carpet cleaner. Irene liked it immediately. Everything here ran on routine and records, not whispers. Nora held the door for her grandmother, who walked with quiet assurance toward the reception desk. The young teller looked up from her computer. "Good morning. How can we help you today?" "I have an appointment with Ms. Ellison," Irene said. 10 o'clock. The teller's eyes flicked to the screen. "You mean Ellie?" "Yes, ma'am. She's expecting you." They followed the woman past cubicles and potted ferns to an office in the back corner. The glass door bore the name Ellie Fraser, branch manager. Inside, a woman in her early 40s looked up from her monitor. "Irene Clark," Ellie said warmly, standing. "It's been a while." "It has," Irene replied, shaking her hand. "And it seems some things need tidying up." "Let's do that then," Ellie said, gesturing to the chairs. "I always liked how organized you are." Nora sat beside her grandmother, placing the blue folder, ever present, on the desk. Ellie opened the file, reviewing the documents Patricia had emailed in advance. Her brows lifted slightly as she reached the notarized POA form naming Nora Clark as agent and co-signer. "So, we're removing Ethan and Brianna Clark from all beneficiary and access listings," Ellie confirmed, her tone professional but edged with quiet curiosity. "That's correct," Irene said. "They've mistaken interest for entitlement." Nora hid a smile behind her hand. Ellie clicked through her system, each keystroke echoing in the stillness of the office. "You had joint beneficiary status on 2 accounts and shared access on 1 investment portfolio. I'll remove both of their names effective immediately. You'll retain full authority, and Nora will be added as secondary signer and monitor." "Monitor?" Nora asked. "It means," Ellie said, smiling, "you'll receive alerts any time there's movement, deposits, withdrawals, changes. You're the second set of eyes." "Perfect," Irene said. "We'll make that official." Ellie printed a set of forms and turned them around for signatures. The paper was warm from the printer, the ink still faintly scented of ozone. Irene signed slowly, each stroke deliberate, while Nora watched, memorizing not just the act, but the poise. When Ellie reached the last confirmation screen, she paused. "One more question, Ms. Clark. Would you like to reset your online password as well?" "Yes," Irene said without hesitation. "And please disable remote access for any previously stored logins." "Even family members?" "Especially family members." Ellie nodded approvingly. "You'd be surprised how often that's necessary." When the forms were complete, Ellie stood to shake their hands. "Everything is secure. They'll receive automated notifications within 24 hours that their access has been revoked." Irene smiled politely. "Then I'll expect a call by 25. It came sooner than that. That evening, as the rain returned in thin, slanted sheets, the house phone rang. Sharp, repetitive, impatient. Nora glanced at the caller ID, Brianna Clark. Irene didn't look up from the crossword she was finishing at the kitchen table. Let it ring. The ringing stopped. Then came the buzz of Nora's cell. Nora answered cautiously. "Hello?" Brianna's voice sliced through the speaker, tight, angry. "What's going on with the accounts? The bank says I'm locked out. There's a note saying access revoked. Did Grandma screw something up again?" Nora met her grandmother's eyes. Irene raised an eyebrow and mouthed, "Put it on speaker." "She's right here," Nora said. There was a pause, then Brianna's voice again, lower, falsely concerned. "Irene, did you forget your password?" They said. "No," Irene interrupted calmly, setting her pen down. "Tell her I remembered it just fine." The silence that followed was exquisite. Brianna's breath hitched audibly. What did you?" "I simply made a few adjustments," Irene said, her voice as even as the rain outside. The kind that makes sense when one realizes who can be trusted with arithmetic. You can't just. Those are joint. They were, Irene corrected softly. Now they're protected. Brianna's tone cracked. You're making a mistake, Irene. You don't understand how complicated this is. Oh, I do, Irene said, leaning back in her chair. I've been teaching people how to solve problems longer than you've been creating them. A click. The line went dead. Nora exhaled a laugh she couldn't contain. She's losing it. Irene smiled faintly. No, dear. She's just realizing she never had it. Later that night, Nora helped her grandmother sort paperwork at the kitchen counter. The sound of rain filled the silence between them. Do you ever feel bad? Nora asked suddenly. For what? For being this far ahead. Irene's eyes softened. No. I feel prepared. There's a difference. They worked quietly after that. Papers neatly stacked, folders labeled, the house warm and orderly against the chaos outside. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and paper, a sharp, sterile scent that clung to Irene's coat as she sat across from Dr. Liz Moreno. The doctor's office was small but bright, with wide windows looking out onto a parking lot slick from last night's rain. A vase of white tulips stood on the counter, their petals too perfect to be real. Ethan and Brianna sat side by side in the corner, whispering in low tones. Ethan fidgeted with his phone. Brianna crossed her legs tightly, foot bouncing with rehearsed impatience. Dr. Moreno adjusted her glasses and smiled at Irene, the kind of smile that was both kind and disarming. Thank you for coming in, Mrs. Clark. These evaluations are pretty standard. Nothing to worry about. I'm not worried, Irene said evenly. Some people just seem to be. Brianna gave a soft, performative laugh. We just thought it would be good to have documentation, you know, for everyone's peace of mind. Dr. Moreno nodded without judgment. Of course. Shall we begin? The test started simply. Words and patterns, lists and repetitions. Irene followed each instruction with the calm of someone solving an old, familiar equation. Please repeat these words. Apple, penny, table. Apple, penny, table. Now, count backward from 100 by sevens. 93, 86, 79, 72. The doctor's pen scratched quietly against the clipboard. Brianna leaned forward slightly, as though expecting Irene to falter. Ethan pretended to check the time. Dr. Moreno flipped the page. Let's try a quick sequence of numbers and recall. She read a set aloud, increasing each line by 1 digit. Irene's answers came back crisp and immediate. Then came logic problems, short equations, and memory puzzles. Irene solved each one before the doctor finished reading. When they reached a spatial diagram meant to test cognitive mapping, Irene turned the page toward her and drew the correct pattern with a soft smile. Dr. Moreno blinked, impressed. You're quite fast. I taught advanced placement math for 3 decades, Irene replied. Speed was part of the job. From the corner, Brianna muttered, maybe she studied these ahead of time. Dr. Moreno looked up sharply. Excuse me? Brianna gave a polished shrug. I just mean, she's always been competitive. Irene's eyes lifted, clear and steady. No, dear, she said. I just know how to recognize repetition, especially when it's malicious. Dr. Moreno hid a smile behind her notes and turned the page. Let's do the final section, word recall. Earlier, I gave you 3 words. Do you remember them? Apple, penny, table. Correct. And now, the doctor said, looking up, a simple arithmetic verification. Irene didn't wait for the prompt. The square root of 144 is 12. The room went still. Ethan shifted, trying to make the moment casual. Well, it's good news then, right? Dr. Moreno set her pen down. Good news is an understatement. She turned the clipboard toward them, her handwriting quick and confident. Mrs. Clark, your cognitive performance falls well above average for your age bracket. In fact, you're sharper than most 50-year-olds I've tested this year. Brianna forced a smile that barely masked the tightening at her jaw. Well, that's great. Maybe she did study the test. Irene's tone turned silk over steel. No, I studied your behavior. That was enough. The words landed like a pin in a balloon. Quiet, devastating, inevitable. Ethan looked at his wife, then back to Irene, his mouth half open as if he might finally say something useful. He didn't. Dr. Moreno leaned back in her chair. There's absolutely no concern regarding Mrs. Clark's mental capacity. I'll be noting that in the record and sending confirmation to your attorney, Mrs. Clark. Patricia Kim, Irene said. She'll appreciate the thoroughness. Of course, Dr. Moreno replied, smiling. When they left the office, the sky had brightened into a dull, wintry blue. Irene walked ahead of them, her pace measured, coat buttoned neatly. Behind her, Brianna's heels clicked sharply, every step a little too quick. At the car, Ethan unlocked the doors without speaking. Irene paused before getting in. Dr. Moreno will forward the report by morning, she said lightly. You should keep an eye out for it. Brianna folded her arms. I'm sure she will. Good, Irene said. Then you'll see it in writing next time you tell someone I'm slipping. Brianna flushed. That's not what I said. Oh, I know exactly what you said, Irene interrupted. And now everyone else will too. She slid into the passenger seat, eyes forward, expression unreadable. Nora had texted her earlier that morning. Bank access still locked. They're furious. Irene typed back one word before Ethan even started the engine. Predictable. By Monday morning, the clouds over Spokane had broken open into a hard, white sky. The air was brittle with cold, and the courthouse steps glistened with ice where the maintenance crew hadn't yet salted. Irene climbed them slowly, not because she needed to, but because she wanted each step to land like punctuation. Patricia met her halfway up the marble staircase, gloves off, briefcase in hand, every movement clean and exact. Everything's prepared, she said. The judge's clerk will process it this afternoon. Restraining clause? Irene asked, her voice steady. Patricia nodded. Filed under medical and financial protection. It prohibits any unauthorized attempt to assess your competency, alter your care, or file guardianship claims without verified cause. They so much as whisper to Adult Protective Services again. It flags as harassment. Perfect. They entered the courthouse together, the sound of their heels sharp against the tile. The clerk recognized Patricia instantly, her presence the kind that made other attorneys lower their voices. Within 10 minutes, the papers were filed, time-stamped and notarized. When they emerged back into the brittle sunlight, Irene exhaled a breath that fogged the air before her. That's one less door they can rattle. Patricia's mouth twitched into a smile. They'll still try. But this time, they'll knock, and I'll answer. The knock came 3 days later. Nora was home when the courier van pulled up. 2 men in gray windbreakers stepped out, official envelopes in hand. Brianna's SUV was parked halfway down the block, idling, engine running. Are you Mrs. Irene Clark? One of the men asked. I am. He handed her a packet of legal documents. Notice of protective filing, certified delivery. I know, she said simply, taking it. I requested it. As the men drove away, Nora peered out the window. They're watching from the car, she whispered. Do you think they know what it is? Oh, they'll know soon enough, Irene said. By dinner time, Patricia called. Delivery confirmed. They've been served. Through the kitchen window, Irene could see Brianna storming up the front walk, coat flapping, Ethan trailing behind like an apology. The doorbell rang once. Hard. Irene didn't flinch. She opened the door halfway, the chain still fastened. "What the hell is this?" Brianna demanded, waving the folded notice like a threat. "Some court order? Against your own family?" "It's not against anyone," Irene said calmly. "It's for me." Ethan's eyes darted between them. "Mom, this is a misunderstanding." "No," Patricia's voice said from behind them. Brianna turned. The attorney was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, a black folder in hand, every inch the storm in human form. "It's a legal protection, and you'd do well to read every line before you embarrass yourself further." "You can't just bar us from helping her," Brianna snapped. Patricia's tone didn't rise, but it carried like thunder. "You're not her agents, not her power, and certainly not her future." Brianna went pale. "We're her family." "Families act in interest, not in acquisition," Patricia said evenly. "Yours has confused the two." Nora appeared behind Irene, standing straight, phone in hand, recording quietly, not out of malice, but memory. "They thought you were weak," she murmured to her grandmother. "You're a fortress." Irene's eyes softened at that. "I'm just old, Nora. Not out." Brianna's mouth opened again, but no sound came. She looked to Ethan, who finally stepped forward, trying to smooth things over. "Mom, maybe we can talk about this privately?" Patricia's eyes flicked toward him. "Privately is what got you here." Irene unlatched the chain and stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting at her cheeks. "You came here uninvited. Now you can leave the same way." Brianna hesitated, fury warring with confusion. "You think this ends it? We'll see about that." Patricia tilted her head slightly. "You already have." Ethan took Brianna's arm. "Let's go," he said quietly. "Now." They left without another word, their car skidding slightly as it reversed too fast down the slick street. Inside, Nora locked the door and turned the deadbolt with a satisfying click. "Do you think they'll stop?" "No," Irene said, setting the notice on the counter. "But they'll start hesitating." "That's better." Patricia gathered her papers. "They'll try to spin it, paint you as paranoid. Be ready for that." Irene smiled faintly. "Let them. I have math, law, and memory on my side." The morning sun finally broke through Spokane's winter haze, washing the frost off Irene's front porch and spilling pale light across the living room. She'd been up since dawn, her coffee half finished and cooling beside a spread of neatly arranged folders on the dining table. Deeds, bank ledgers, the will that once named her son as beneficiary. Now, that name was a liability. Patricia arrived precisely at 9, as promised, wrapped in a gray wool coat and efficiency. She stepped inside, scanning the table. "You're ready." "I've been ready for years," Irene replied. Nora joined them moments later, still tucking her hair into a loose braid. She looked from one woman to the other, sensing the gravity. "Is this the part where we make it permanent?" Patricia set down her briefcase. "This is the part where we make it clear." She opened a leather-bound portfolio, sliding a new set of documents forward, clean, heavy paper that carried the weight of permanence. "This is your updated will, Mrs. Clark. As of today, Ethan and Brianna Clark are removed as heirs and beneficiaries. All financial, real property, and fiduciary responsibilities transfer to Nora Clark, effective upon your passing. You remain full owner and executor until then." Irene's gaze lingered on the words, tracing the neat black lines like an architect reviewing blueprints of her own freedom. "Remove them entirely?" "Entirely," Patricia confirmed. "There'll be no confusion about intent. I've already recorded the transfer amendment for your home title as well. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. When you're gone, the house is Nora's. Automatically. No probate. No contest." Nora's breath caught. "You did all this already?" Patricia smiled faintly. I like to stay a step ahead of people who think they're clever. Irene reached for the pen. The metal felt cold between her fingers, grounding. She signed with the same precision she once used to grade exam papers. Steady, deliberate, unforgiving. Each stroke felt like cutting a cord that had frayed long ago. When she was done, Patricia sealed the documents into a folder marked executed and filed. Nora exhaled slowly, eyes flicking to her grandmother. You really mean to do this? I gave them years, Irene said, her voice quiet but threaded with iron. They gave me gossip. Patricia closed her briefcase with a click. Legacies don't forgive whispers. They remember them. For a moment, the three women stood in the stillness that follows irreversible acts. The house seemed to hold its breath. Nora crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her grandmother. You still have me? Irene smiled softly against her shoulder. That's the only part I want to keep. By late afternoon, the paperwork was filed, notarized, and delivered. The last of the old will, signed, dated, and obsolete, sat on Irene's desk beside the shredder. She hesitated, fingertips brushing the yellowing paper. There was her husband's signature in faded ink, Ethan's name written beneath hers like a promise that never held. Then she fed the first page into the shredder. The blades hummed, soft but relentless, eating history line by line until it was nothing but confetti. She didn't look away once. When it was over, she unplugged the machine, coiled the cord, and placed it neatly in the closet. The act felt like closing a chapter with math's cold symmetry. Problem identified, equation balanced, error removed. The house was hers again. The future, Nora's. Outside, the mail truck rolled by. Through the frosted window, Irene saw the courier slip a single envelope into her box, thick, government-stamped. She walked out to retrieve it, the cold air biting at her face. The return address read, Spokane County Records Office. She tore it open on the porch. Inside was the updated property deed, her name and Nora's side by side, ownership bound by law and intent. She smiled, the smallest flicker of triumph warming her in the chill. That evening, as twilight settled, Nora helped her grandmother set the table for dinner. No guests, no tension, just warmth. Do you think they'll find out? Nora asked. Oh, they'll find out, Irene said. But not from me. Patricia's voice, crisp on speakerphone, filled the quiet as she confirmed the filings. Everything's in the system. If they call my office, they'll hit a wall of documentation. Good, Irene said. Walls make fine teachers. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, plain envelope, no return address, the kind that tried to look harmless. Inside, a single page, notice of scheduled home visit, Adult Protective Services. Nora found it first. They actually did it, she said, her voice low, almost incredulous. Irene read the page once, slowly, then folded it back into the envelope. Let them come, she said. I'll put on the kettle. The day of the visit, the sky was pale and metallic, the air heavy with the smell of wet cedar. Irene wore a soft blue sweater, pearls at her neck, and her hair neatly pinned. The living room looked like a magazine spread. Books alphabetized, mantel dusted, a plate of lemon cookies cooling on the counter. At exactly 2:00, a knock sounded. 3 polite raps. When Irene opened the door, a woman in her 50s stood there, clipboard in hand, raincoat still damp from outside. Mrs. Irene Clark? I'm Karen Holloway, Adult Protective Services. We spoke briefly on the phone. You did, Irene said pleasantly. Come in. Shoes off, please. The floors are new. Karen smiled at that, already disarmed. Thank you, ma'am. Inside, she paused, taking in the room. Everything gleamed. Photos of Nora at science fairs lined the hallway. Framed certificates from Irene's years of teaching hung in perfect symmetry along the staircase. Nora entered from the kitchen, wiping her hands. Tea's ready. Karen blinked, surprised. You didn't have to go to any trouble. Oh, I always serve tea for guests, Irene said, pouring with steady hands. Even the uninvited ones. Karen chuckled awkwardly. This isn't an accusation, Mrs. Clark. It's a routine wellness visit. We just got a call from my daughter-in-law, Irene finished. Yes, I suspected. Karen hesitated, pen hovering. You're aware of who reported the concern? I'm aware of her pattern, Irene said, settling gracefully into her chair. Please, sit. Ask what you need. The investigator did. She asked about medications, bills, daily routines. Irene answered each question with unhurried precision, every detail verifiable. When Karen asked about her finances, Irene gestured toward a neat folder already on the coffee table. My accounts, statements, and legal designations, updated, notarized, and logged with both my attorney and my granddaughter. Nora handed over a second folder, Patricia's letters, POA certification, and copies of the cognitive assessment signed by Dr. Moreno, each page labeled, dated, and highlighted. Karen flipped through them, her expression softening. You're very organized, Mrs. Clark. I was a math teacher, Irene said, smiling faintly. Organization is how we keep chaos honest. Outside, the wind rattled the gutters. Karen took a sip of her tea, eyes lifting toward Nora. You live here with your grandmother? Yes, Nora said. I'm her designated agent on her power of attorney. You can verify with her attorney, Patricia Kim. Karen nodded, scribbling a note. She's one of the best in the state. That's why we hired her, Irene said. The rest of the visit moved quickly. Karen checked light switches, smoke detectors, the refrigerator. Everything worked. Everything was full. Everything. Normal. When she finally closed her folder, she smiled in a way that seemed genuine. Mrs. Clark, you're clearly competent and well supported. There's no concern about your capacity, care, or living environment. I'll be closing this file today. Thank you, Irene said simply, standing to walk her to the door. And please, do note on your report, this is not the first time someone's mistaken caution for confusion. Karen chuckled. I'll put it in nicer words, but yes, I'll note that. They shook hands at the door. Rain had begun again, soft and steady. Karen turned at the walkway, calling back. You make a great cup of tea, Mrs. Clark. I try to keep things strong, Irene replied. That night, Patricia called. The APS investigator filed her report. Case closed. No follow-up. You're officially clear. I know, Irene said, sipping her tea by the window. She thanked me for the cookies. Patricia's tone softened. You handled that beautifully. I handled it truthfully, Irene corrected. That's harder to twist. The next morning, a voicemail waited on Irene's phone. Brianna's voice, brittle and tight. I don't know what you said to them, but they won't reopen the case. They told me there's no reason for further review. Do you understand what that means? Irene listened once, then hit delete. Nora leaned against the counter, grinning. She sounds desperate. She sounds predictable, Irene said. Nora hesitated. What happens now? Irene looked out the window where the rain had turned to snow, white flakes layering the porch like clean paper. Now, she said quietly, we write the rest without them. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the yard glazed in white and silence. Irene stood by the window with her cup of coffee, watching sunlight glint off the frozen branches. The world looked clean, unbothered. Inside, her phone sat on the counter, a red light blinking steadily. A message waiting to be heard, or ignored. Nora was the one who broke the stillness. It's her again, she said softly, nodding toward the phone. Irene didn't answer right away. She took another sip, her eyes on the quiet street. Let's hear it then. Nora pressed play. Brianna's voice filled the room, brittle but performative. Irene, I just wanted to talk. I don't know why you've been avoiding us, but this is getting ridiculous. You're letting that lawyer poison you against your own family. We're worried about you. People are starting to ask questions. Maybe it's not too late to fix this. If you'd just call me back. The message ended with the faint sound of a sigh, one rehearsed for sympathy, not sorrow. Irene stood there a moment longer, then reached out and pressed delete. The red light blinked once more, then disappeared. Nora frowned. You're not even going to respond? No. Don't you want to say something back? Just once. Irene turned from the window, her expression serene. That would give her what she wants, a stage. I prefer math to theater. Nora smiled despite herself. That's cold. It's clear, Irene corrected. Clarity feels colder to the ones who lied first. By afternoon, Patricia dropped by, shaking snow from her coat. She looked pleased, like someone whose plan was unfolding exactly as predicted. I stopped by to have you sign an acknowledgement for the APS report. Closure for the record. Closure sounds lovely, Irene said, taking the pen. Patricia sat across from her, glancing at the phone on the counter. She's been calling, hasn't she? Voicemail, Nora said. Grandma didn't answer. Good, Patricia replied. Smartest silence I've seen all year. Irene smiled faintly, sliding the signed page across the table. She keeps trying to make noise. I keep choosing peace. One of us will tire first. Patricia gathered the papers, then leaned back in her chair. I've seen hundreds of these cases, Irene. People like Brianna, manipulators with charm. They don't know what to do when their audience stops reacting. You're dismantling her without lifting a finger. Funny, Irene said softly. That's how she started with me. That evening, Nora scrolled through her phone at the kitchen counter, a soft blue light reflecting across her face. She posted again, she said. Irene looked up from her crossword. About me? Sort of. Nora read the words aloud, voice half disbelief, half amusement. Some people forget where they come from, especially when they've convinced themselves they're better than the ones who raised them. Patricia exhaled a low, humorless laugh, cryptic and self-pitying, classic deflection. She tagged Ethan, Nora added, and a bunch of neighbors. Looks like she wants sympathy. Irene closed her crossword, laid the pencil down neatly, and said, Let her write fiction. I'm the only one holding the truth in ink. Nora grinned. You should post that. I don't post, Irene said. I file. Patricia chuckled. If I ever retire, I'm handing my clients over to you. I'd scare them off, Irene said. Later, after Patricia left, the house was quiet again. The snow outside had deepened, covering everything in a smooth, undisturbed layer. Nora sat on the couch with a blanket, scrolling once more, curiosity unspent. She's doubled down, she said. Now she's saying she's worried you're being controlled. Irene didn't answer. She rose, went to the fireplace, and set a fresh log in place. The flames crackled, catching quickly. Finally, she said, People who lose control always call it concern. Nora looked at her grandmother, silhouetted against the glow of the fire, her profile sharp and calm. You're not scared of her at all, are you? I was, Irene admitted. Once. When I still believed family meant safety. She turned toward the window, the snow outside reflecting the firelight. Now I believe in evidence. The first time Irene returned to the coffee mornings at the church hall, the air smelled of cinnamon rolls and forgiveness. The folding tables were covered in checkered cloths, steam rising from styrofoam cups, chatter moving in warm, easy waves. Heads turned as she walked in. Not in pity this time, but in curiosity, the kind that leans toward respect once a story has made its rounds. "Morning, Irene," called Helen McCarthy from the pastry table. "Haven't seen you in a while?" Irene smiled, her scarf tucked neatly into her coat. "I've been busy settling a few equations." Helen blinked, then laughed. "Heard what you did." "Good for you." The others nodded, murmuring their own versions of the same. What she'd done, the bank changes, the court filings, the APS visit, had made their way through town like an urban legend of calm retaliation. Spokane wasn't large, and a woman who refused to be quietly erased became a kind of folklore. Irene poured herself coffee, the kind that tasted faintly of the urn it came from, and joined the small group near the window. Martha Jensen, who'd run the library fund for 20 years, leaned forward conspiratorially. "You're coming back to church this Sunday, right? Pastor said you were always good with numbers. We're expanding the reading room. Need someone to handle donations and inventory." "I could do that," Irene said, her tone soft but assured. "Wonderful," Martha said, smiling wide. "It's good to see you again, Irene. We missed your steadiness." Steadiness. The word lingered in the air like a benediction. Across the room, Nora was helping refill sugar packets, blending easily with the older crowd. Every so often, someone would pat her arm or tell her, "You've got her backbone," and Nora would just smile. "I learned from the best." That Sunday, the church was full. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, scattering blues and golds across the pews. The air was heavy with the smell of old hymnals and polished wood. Irene arrived 10 minutes early, the way she always had when she was younger, when punctuality still felt like control. She chose a pew halfway back, visible but not on display. Nora sat beside her, her notebook for the library fund already open. Patricia joined them halfway through the first hymn, sliding in with the composed precision of someone who preferred courtrooms to congregations. She whispered, "You're a hard woman to schedule on Sundays now." "I needed to see faces again," Irene said. "It's good to be known for what's true." When the service ended, Pastor Dana mentioned the new reading fund. "We'll be accepting donations all week," she said brightly, "and Mrs. Irene Clark has kindly agreed to oversee our accounts." Applause spread through the pews, gentle, genuine. Irene rose, gave a small nod, and said, "I'll be donating the first check, in my granddaughter's name." Nora's eyes went wide. "Grandma, it's time your name went on something that lasts," Irene said. Martha beamed from the front row. "That's wonderful, Irene." Patricia leaned over, smiling. "Respect is contagious when you protect it." Outside, the sky had brightened, snow melting from the church steps. Irene walked slowly through the crowd of familiar faces, neighbors, former students, parents of students now grown. People stopped to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her quietly, "You did right by yourself." And for the first time in months, she felt something like peace, earned rather than given. Then she saw Brianna. Across the churchyard, by the parked cars, her daughter-in-law stood half-hidden beneath a black umbrella, her expression pinched and brittle. She wasn't talking to anyone, just watching. Their eyes met through the drifting snow. Brianna's face flickered, anger, disbelief, then something else. Fear, maybe, the kind that comes when a person realizes the narrative has slipped beyond their reach. Nora followed Irene's gaze. She showed up. "She had to," Irene said. "Control needs an audience." They walked past her without slowing. Brianna's mouth opened, but no words came. Patricia, close behind, murmured, "Let her stand in her weather." As they reached the car, Irene glanced once more at the church, the people still chatting on the steps, the small pocket of warmth she'd reclaimed. "This," she said quietly, "is what she can't fabricate." The next morning, the kitchen table looked more like a command center than a place for breakfast. Folders, flash drives, and printed statements were lined in deliberate symmetry, each stack labeled in Irene's steady handwriting. The kettle hissed softly behind her as snowlight spilled across the wood grain. Nora sat across from her, laptop open, headphones half on. "I've scanned everything up to 2019. You sure you want me to include the bank removals?" "Yes," Irene said, sipping her tea. "If you hide nothing, they can invent nothing." Patricia arrived right on time, 9 sharp, as always. She brushed a light dusting of snow from her coat before setting her briefcase on the table. "You've been busy," she said, eyeing the meticulous piles. "I like my piece organized," Irene replied. Patricia smiled. "Then this is going to end beautifully." They spent the morning building what Patricia called the final file trail. Every transaction, signature, court notice, and certification was copied, cross-referenced, and stamped with corresponding dates. Even Dr. Aisha Moreno's assessment, complete with the line, "No indication of cognitive decline," was included. Nora worked quietly, transferring files onto 2 silver USB drives. Each glinted in the winter light like evidence turned elegant. "I made 2 backups," she said. "One for you, one for me." Patricia nodded approvingly. "And 1 copy for me, encrypted, just in case your relatives ever develop selective memory." Irene leaned back, folding her hands. "They'll try. But this time, there'll be paper waiting to contradict them." By noon, Patricia drafted a 2-page cover letter on firm letterhead. At the top, it read, "Family statement, legal clarification, and record of competency." The language was sharp and cold in its civility, every line an exercise in controlled precision. It cited Washington state law, certification of mental competency, guardianship revocation clauses, and property filings. It ended with Irene's own signature, written in blue ink beneath a single line. Patricia insisted on including, "Truth, properly documented, doesn't need defense." Patricia reviewed it once more, then looked up. "You ready for distribution?" Irene nodded. "Send it everywhere," she's tried to whisper. And they did. Patricia's assistant faxed and emailed copies to every office Brianna had ever contacted. Banks, clinics, the county court clerk, the credit union, even the local real estate firm that had once handled the house appraisal. Each recipient received the same message. "Mrs. Irene M. Clark is legally competent, financially autonomous, and fully represented by counsel." Nora watched the confirmations come through, one by one, her phone pinging with each receipt. "That's 17 copies total," she said. 18, Patricia corrected. "One went to her employer." Nora blinked. "You sent it to Brianna's work?" Patricia's tone was cool. "If she's been gossiping about her mother-in-law's decline, her HR department deserves context." Irene didn't flinch. "Good." She took another sip of tea. "Let her explain that at lunch." By late afternoon, the snow outside had begun to melt into slush. The printer on the counter hummed softly, finishing the last of the batch. Irene stacked the final documents into a single blue folder, the same one she'd pulled from her cabinet months ago, the folder that had started everything. She traced its label with her fingertip. "Strange how safety ends up looking like paperwork." Patricia smiled. "Safety usually does." She slipped her copy into her briefcase. "That's it, Irene. Nothing left for them to twist." For a long moment they just sat in the quiet hum of the room, the sound of Nora's typing fading to stillness. Irene exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that came after a long-held calculation reached balance. "Then I suppose we've reached the proof," she said. That night, Nora carried the USB drives upstairs and placed one in the small safe in her room. The other she slid into her grandmother's jewelry box, beside the pearls Irene had worn to her wedding 50 years ago. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Somewhere across town, a phone was ringing. A call Brianna wouldn't answer, not yet. Her name was on too many of those emails. By the following Tuesday, the last of the snow had turned to rain again. Thin, relentless, cleansing. Irene stood at her writing desk by the window. The kind of old mahogany surface that had seen a lifetime of grades, letters, and decisions. Now it was witnessing her final one. The lamp threw a warm circle of light across the paper. The letterhead bore Patricia Kim's emblem in gold at the top. The words beneath were simple, formal, and absolute. Termination of involvement. Effective immediately, Ethan and Brianna Clark are hereby removed and restricted from all medical, financial, and legal roles concerning the affairs of Mrs. Irene M. Clark. Irene read it twice, the rain filling the silence between the lines. It was not angry, just definitive. The kind of statement no argument could soften and no apology could undo. She signed her name in firm blue ink. The nib of her pen caught the light, leaving the faintest reflection before the ink settled into permanence. Across the table, Nora watched, eyes bright with a mix of pride and disbelief. "You really did it," she whispered. "No," Irene said, sliding the letter into an envelope. "I finished it." At Patricia's office that afternoon, the mood was all clean lines and quiet efficiency. Patricia had prepared a stack of forms beside her laptop, each one sealing off another route of manipulation. Financial authorizations, power of attorney confirmations, estate access locks, and living trust verifications. When Irene entered, Patricia stood and offered a rare smile. "Everything's in place. All we need is your signature on the closure affidavit." "Closure," Irene repeated, testing the word. "A polite way of saying goodbye?" "Legally polite," Patricia said, sliding the papers forward. Irene sat, her movements measured. The pen moved steadily across page after page, each signature a surgical incision cutting out the last infection of interference. Patricia gathered them into a neat pile and sealed the final folder with a gold sticker. "It's done. They can't touch the accounts, can't request information, can't act on your behalf. They're formally barred from any financial or medical claim." "Then it's finished," Irene said softly. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying her client. "You understand, Irene. You didn't just win a legal battle, you redefined the rules they were playing by." "I taught geometry," Irene replied. "Redefining boundaries is second nature." The next morning, Patricia's courier delivered certified letters to Ethan and Brianna's address. Each envelope bore the embossed seal of Kim and Associates, attorneys at law. By evening, the phone began to ring again. First Ethan's number, then Brianna's. Nora muted both. "They'll read it before they call," Irene said, her voice calm. "They'll still call," Nora replied. "Of course. People always beg the rules to bend before they break." She turned back to the window where the rain had slowed to a quiet drizzle. The neighborhood streetlights shimmered against wet pavement, reflected in orderly pools of amber light. The next day, Patricia called to confirm delivery. "They signed for the letters at 9:14 this morning. My assistant said Brianna looked like she'd swallowed glass." Irene chuckled softly. "That sounds about right." "Everything's locked now," Patricia continued. "The estate, the insurance, the trust, even your online profiles. Nothing can be moved without dual authentication between you and Nora." Irene nodded. "Fireproof, then?" "Exactly." Patricia hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I've rarely seen someone reclaim their life so elegantly." "That's the thing about dignity," Irene said. "It isn't stolen, it's surrendered. I just stopped giving mine away." Patricia smiled. "I'll drink to that." That evening, Nora sat on the couch scrolling through her messages. "She posted again," she said, shaking her head. "It's all veiled complaints. family betrayal, elder confusion, the usual. Irene didn't even look up from her crossword. She's writing her own obituary, only she doesn't know it yet. Nora laughed quietly. They really underestimated you. Irene set down her pencil. Most manipulators do. They count on reaction, not preparation. Outside, thunder rumbled across the valley. The storm was moving east toward the mountains. Irene rose, crossed to the desk, and opened her ledger, her own handwritten record of every step she'd taken since the first whisper of slipping. She flipped to the final page and wrote one word in careful cursive: resolved. Then she closed the book, turned off the lamp, and let the sound of rain finish the sentence for her. By late November, Spokane was dressed in its first true winter coat. Frost clung to the porch railings and the air outside carried that deep hush only cold weather can make. Inside Irene's house, warmth gathered in corners, steam rising from the oven, soft music humming from the old kitchen radio. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, rich and grounding. It was the first Thanksgiving Irene had hosted since her husband's death, and the first since she'd drawn the line between herself and her son's family. The dining table gleamed beneath the overhead light. The old lace runner was pressed, the silver polished, the plates arranged in perfect symmetry. Nora moved around the room, adjusting candles, folding napkins into neat triangles. "Looks perfect," she said, standing back to admire it. "It looks honest," Irene replied, setting down the final bowl of stuffing. "There's a difference." The clock ticked softly. Outside, snow flurries began to fall again, scattering like ash in the streetlight glow. Nora took a breath, then asked, "Do you ever miss them? Even a little?" Irene paused, smoothing the edge of the tablecloth. Missing someone and needing them are two very different equations. "I solved that one already." Nora smiled faintly. "Of course you did." The doorbell rang just before 4. Patricia was first to arrive, carrying a bottle of wine and the kind of smile that came easily to a woman who'd watched things resolve in her client's favor. "Good to see the fortress holding strong," she said, stepping inside. "It's not a fortress," Irene replied, helping her with her coat. "It's just a house with the right locks." Moments later came Martha Jensen from the church, cheeks red from the cold, hands clutching a pie tin. "Pumpkin," she said, brushing snow off her sleeves. "Not the canned kind either. You deserve real." "Then you're staying for dessert," Irene said. They gathered around the table. Just 4 women. No performance. No pretense. Laughter rose naturally, the kind that didn't need to defend itself. The turkey was carved. The wine poured. And for the first time in years, Irene's dining room sounded like life rather than tension. The clatter of silverware replaced the whispers that used to crawl through the walls. Between courses, Patricia raised her glass. "To good decisions and clean paperwork." Nora laughed. "That sounds exactly like something you'd toast to." Patricia winked. "You'd be surprised how many happy endings begin with proper documentation." Even Irene smiled at that. When the plates were cleared and coffee brewed, Irene disappeared briefly into her study. She returned with the blue folder, worn now at the edges, the one that had followed her from fear to freedom. She set it on the table beside her teacup. Martha glanced at it curiously. "You brought your files to dinner?" Irene traced a finger along the label. "No," she said quietly. "I brought what started it all, so I'd remember what not to invite back in." Nora tilted her head. "You mean them?" "I mean whispers," Irene said. "They used to sit right here, between the plates, behind the smiles. Not anymore." She opened the folder, revealing the notarized POA, her signature sharp and unshaken. "No more whispers at my table." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the heater and the faint patter of snow outside. Patricia reached over, resting a hand briefly on Irene's wrist. You've done more than protect yourself. You've built a map for anyone who needs to do the same. Irene met her gaze, then let it stay unfolded. As night deepened, the women lingered in the glow of the fire, the dishes stacked, the air fragrant with cinnamon and resolve. Nora leaned back in her chair, watching her grandmother, her calm, her grace, her stillness. You know, Nora said, most people would have shouted or fought, or tried to prove themselves louder. I don't need to shout, Irene said, her voice soft but unwavering. Silence carries farther when the truth's already spoken. The morning after Thanksgiving was still and silver. Frost glazed the windows, and the house smelled faintly of coffee, firewood, and whatever warmth lingers when good company has gone home. Irene moved slowly through the living room, her slippers whispering against the wood floor. On the table by the fireplace sat the blue folder, its edges soft from use, its presence both comforting and final. She ran her fingertips along the embossed label once more. POA, updated 2019. 5 years, she murmured, and every one of them earned. From the hallway, Nora appeared with a small brass frame tucked under her arm. Grandma, where do you want it? Irene smiled faintly. By the window, I think. The light's good there. Nora knelt on the arm of the sofa, hammer and nail in hand, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The framed document caught the morning glow as she hung it. A letter signed in Dr. Moreno's careful handwriting, the official notice of full cognitive competency. Irene stepped back to look at it. The embossed seal shimmered gold against the paper, solid proof that every whisper, every rumor, every false kindness had been wrong. It looks like art, Nora said. It is, Irene replied, art built from evidence. Patricia arrived just before noon, her coat dusted with snow. She carried her usual leather briefcase, but today she didn't open it. I come empty-handed, she said, smiling. That's how you know it's over. Not over, Irene corrected gently, pouring her tea. Just balanced. Patricia accepted the cup, lowering herself into the armchair beside the window. Balanced, she echoed. That's a good word for it. They sat in companionable silence, watching the snow outside thicken to a slow drift. Nora joined them, curling up on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her. Patricia gestured toward the framed certificate. Fitting spot, it belongs in plain sight. That's the idea, Irene said. Truth shouldn't need to hide. Patricia's eyes softened. You know, they never stood a chance. You moved like someone who'd already done the math. Irene chuckled. I had to. They kept trying to rewrite the problem. Later that afternoon, when Patricia had gone and the house grew quiet again, Irene carried the blue folder into her study. She unlocked the small safe built into the wall, her husband's old one, with its heavy dial and satisfying click. Inside sat her will, her property titles, the USB drives, and a single photograph. Her wedding day, the two of them laughing, sunlight catching the white of her dress. She placed the folder on top, closed the door, and turned the lock until it clicked shut. The sound was small, but it filled the room like punctuation at the end of a long, perfect sentence. She stood there for a moment, resting her palm against the cold metal. That'll do, she whispered. When she returned to the kitchen, Nora was waiting with 2 mugs of tea. She slid one across the table. You know, Nora said, I've been thinking. Everything you did, it wasn't just about protecting yourself. You showed me how to stand tall. Irene smiled, the kind that came from deep understanding rather than pride. Good, she said, because I'm done standing for them. Nora nodded slowly, her eyes bright. You really mean that, don't you? I do, Irene said. and I mean it kindly. Some people only learn who they are when you stop holding them up. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. The snow kept falling, steady, unhurried. Irene took a sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle into her hands. Nora reached across the table, squeezing her grandmother's fingers. So what now? Now, Irene said, we live the quiet part of the story. As the light began to fade, she walked once more to the window. The framed certificate glowed in the reflection of the fireplace, a testament to the truth she'd refused to surrender. Her house was calm now, her name unshakable, her silence sharper than any defense. In the corner of the study, the safe sat closed. Inside it, her legacy neatly folded between sheets of blue and white paper. She smiled, softly at first, then with certainty. DIL said, "She's mentally slipping," she murmured, her voice steady and low. So I sat down with her power of attorney in my hand. The snow fell thicker outside, the world hushed and whole again. And for the first time in years, Irene Clark allowed herself to simply be, unbent, unafraid, and finally, free.